Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for clicking and watching. This presentation was first put together for a writers group. I have recorded it again for anyone who wants to hear how I, as a total fly by the seat of my pants kind of novel writer, am attempting to become more skilled at planning and the reasons why I think this is a necessary development of my craft, what I hope to get out of it, becoming less panster and more planner. Just quickly then, these are the four main points I'm going to cover. A quick introduction to me, how I write, the Panster style versus the planner style, and finally some advice that and useful things that I have found helpful. Now then, this presentation is all about me, not in any kind of egotistical way. Just want to make the point that the only thing I ever claim to be an outright expert on are the various contents of my own mind and my heart at any point or another, and possibly even then, only some of those can I be described as being expert on. The point is, though, that this is a presentation about my experience and perspective on the process of writing from the Panster end of the scale, looking towards the planning end. Another point that I just want to make before we get into it. I'm going to inevitably describe 2 points, a starting point and a finishing point even, which we will assume is success. And I am, for the sake of brevity, going to draw the line between them as relatively straight, as illustrated on the slide. But please know that this is more of the journey I have taken between those 2 points. Plenty of false starts, cul-de-sacs, U-turns and indecisions. If I was taking you on a car journey, you would be seriously concerned about my skills. But we are all like this. Never does something complex and difficult, such as writing, editing, publishing and successfully selling a book to loads of eager readers, hopefully, come easily. The roadmap will always end up looking a bit like a tree rather than a telegraph pole. Now, it's important for my sort of own sense of self to make this clear before I go any further, really, because I sit in audiences listening to speakers who are talking about their work, their success, and I always find myself wondering how they achieved it so simply, so quickly, so obviously, and then compare their outward description to my inner experience and finding myself feeling bad about myself. Yes, I know that comparisonitis is a silly thing to inflict upon one's confidence, but there it is. And again, I think we all do this. So this is my release you from the comparisonitis strictures, or at the very least, it is my don't blame me caveat card. Please know that I, like you, am doing my best guess at life. Nevertheless, I hope that hearing my perspective on those guesses will prove useful in some small way to your own long and winding roads. Now then, these are my 3 books published under the series name Beyond Veils, and I just love looking at the colours. I think the designer who did them for me is an extremely talented young lady, and I was sensible enough to notice that. Okay, some stats and facts about the books. They're available in the paperback, ebook and audiobook formats, except for that last one. It's not yet done in audiobook. They've garnered 44 reviews between them, 42 of which are 5-star, which is lovely. And of course, the point of me, my first one, did actually achieve the #1 spot in 14 Amazon categories when it was first published back in 2017. And that was across 4 countries, the UK, the US, Canada and Australia. And I'm currently writing a 4th novel, which will be a standalone story. So I knew I would be an author when I was awarded the English Literature Cup whilst at primary school for my stories. The proudest moment of my writing life so far, one might argue. I began writing my first book 33 years later. Better late than never, hey? There is a story to that, which I'm happy to speak to about anyone if you bother to contact me. There is a reason I waited 33 years. Okay, just also to mention before we get into it that those of you who haven't met me before, I am an indie author. I have published all of my books myself, and very quickly, I'm an independent author because of these 4 aspects. Basically, I've been in business, run my own businesses before, so sitting and waiting for somebody else to give me the go-ahead isn't necessarily in my nature. The books that I write, the genre that I write, are what you would call niche. You would never, I don't expect to ever see my books on the supermarket shelves, for instance, as some other genres might be more obviously expected. I kind of think that all authors have to do this independent stuff anyway. Even if you are traditionally published, your publisher is going to have a certain amount of budget to promote you, and then they'll be on to promoting the other authors. So having to build a fan base, marketing platforms, so on and so forth is kind of in the to-do list of every author. So if you've got to do it yourself anyway, then why not do the whole thing? And finally, possibly the most pertinent, is that I'm very impatient. I didn't want to wait for somebody else's view on whether I'm commercial. My books aren't commercial. And whether I was catching a trendy wave at a particular time. I basically wanted to write the books I wanted to write and get them out to the readers. So that is, in a nutshell, an independent author. And indeed, it can feel like this when it's going well, and it can also feel like this when it's going well and going badly. All right, let's get to the main point of today, how I construct my story. I'm going to focus on the writing bit of writing rather than the inspiration bit of writing. How one gets one's ideas that bring one to the writing desk is separate for the purposes of today, at least. But having said that, just for a moment, I just want to stick with the topic of inspiration. One of the best stories I've heard about how creative inspiration can arrive is the one that Liz Gilbert tells about the American poet Ruth Stone. It's in her Big Magic book, and I think she also talks about it in a couple of her TED Talks too. So Liz met Ruth when Ruth was 90 years old, and Ruth told Liz that when she was a child growing up on a farm in rural Virginia, she would often be out working in the fields when she would sometimes hear a poem coming toward her, and she would describe it, hearing it as it rushing across the landscape at her like a galloping horse. Whenever this happened, she knew exactly what she had to do next. She would run like hell toward the house, trying to stay ahead of the poem, hoping to get to a piece of paper and a pencil fast enough to catch it. That way, when the poem reached and passed through her, she would be able to grab it and take dictation, letting the words pour forth onto the page. Now, sometimes, however, she was too slow and she couldn't get to the paper and pencil in time. In those instances, she could feel the poem rushing right through her body and out the other side, so it is told. It would be in her for a moment, seeking a response, and then it would be gone before she could grasp it, galloping away across the earth, as she said, searching for another poet. Now sometimes, and this is the bit that Liz enjoyed the most, and why not, just listen to it, Ruth would nearly miss the poem, but not quite. She would just barely catch it, she explained, by the tail. Then she would almost physically pull the poem back into her with one hand, even as she was taking dictation with the other. In these instances, the poem would appear on the page from the last word to the first, backward but intact. How totally cool is that, huh? I mean, who doesn't love the romance of that? And I think that's the point of this story of Ruth's. It's a romantic, wondrous tale, no pun intended, of how we can be handed something out of thin air, something beautiful, which other people will admire us for creating, or possibly we should say co-creating. It is this part of all our hearts that lends credence to the myth of the tortured artist being the only valid method of creating true art. That's a topic that Ms. Gilbert also deals with in that Big Magic book. So, whilst I love the idea of Ruth simply having to run fast enough to capture ideas for her acclaimed poems, the act of writing is often a far more prosaic affair. Let's have a look at what some of the greats over history have had to say. There is nothing new to writing, says dear old Ernie. All you have to do is sit down at a typewriter and bleed. Thanks, that's very useful. The best tip for writing, says David, is just to write, to sit down and write, to begin doing it and not to be scared by the blank page. Actually, that's excellent advice. I really do like that one. Neil Gaiman says, this is how you do it. You sit down at the keyboard and you put one word after another until it's done. It's that easy and that hard. Amen to that. And finally, Mark Twain. Writing is easy. All you have to do is cross out the wrong words. Oh, Lordy. I do love those great quotes. More often than not, though, for me, and I suspect you also, the act of writing isn't just holding on to that tale of divine galloping inspiration long enough for us to scribble the words down. It is, as I say, more of a prosaic act, the act of turning up and getting on with it. So yeah, these are some good quotes about how easy or not it is to write a story. It is really, really easy, and it is really, really hard. Of course, all of them make the point that when it boils down to it, writing is the act of placing words upon a surface. So how long did it take me to put down words upon a surface, and how did I do it? The first book, The Point of Me, took me 3 years to write the first draft. Having finally got around to doing this thing called writing, I admit that I was like a kid in a candy store. I mean, finally here I was being a writer rather than just finding excuses to not do it. So I really enjoyed the whole affair. I use that word deliberately, affair. I savoured it. I indulged myself. I did not think about consequences. I look back on my records from that time and I realise I cannot tell you much detail from those years, that's 2014 to 2017, because I did not think through how useful it might be to my future self to have a record of my daily progress or anything really. This book's plot was sketched out in 5 minutes in response to a challenge by my husband, in turn a response to something I had been told in a sole purpose reading. I'd been told I would write books, hooray, and that unicorns were key. Well, I was not happy about the idea of writing about pink stardust type unicorns, so I was complaining to my husband about the prophecy when he made his challenge. Well, Rachel, if you're going to write about a unicorn, what would your unicorn look and feel like? I'm taking this phone call. When I get back, you're going to have your story planned out. And that's where I started, on a big A3 piece of paper that I had to hand. The beginning point was the character of James, who I knew would be 17 years old and have a terminal illness. Next came Marcham, the mystical beast himself, and the definition of what I believe these creatures actually are. From there came James's sister Lyra. At 7 years old to his 17, she is much younger than him, but is possessed of a wisdom far beyond her years. I had the name of his mother and his father, but not much else. But I did know that the plot line would include 3 shamanic style spiritual journeys, in which James would begin to understand what the point of his short life was. And that was literally it, the plotting that I did. I wrote the story piecemeal, as and when ideas came to me. I did not think it would be anything other than a single story, and remained convinced of that right up to the point of publication. The second book, The Truth of Her, took me 1 year to write the first draft, so I'm getting better. I started in early January 2018 and finished in late January 2019. Now, having had a taste of what getting oneself published actually involved, I was a little bit more organised, but not much more. I did at least keep a track of my word count and the topics of the scenes I was writing, but I was still essentially starting from a similar process point as I'd done the first. I knew the second book would focus on Lyra's story in the aftermath of the first book's ending. I also, of course, had the advantage to know 2 of the other main characters rather better than I had for the first book, that's Lyra's mum and dad. I still wrote in a patchwork fashion, jumping upon ideas for scenes and moments, deciding to worry about what the overall quilt looked like once I'd got as many patches as I needed. And then to the third book, which took me 8 months to begin and finish the first draft. So, progress. I'm definitely getting more accomplished. My routine was becoming more established, and with it my discipline to achieve a particular target of word count per day. Don't forget those sages in the Literary Hall of Fame. Much of the process of writing is simply about sitting one's butt in a seat and typing word after word after word. If, like me, you manage to do that on a consistent basis, you will also find a story has appeared after a certain period of time. So, whilst I was inevitably getting quicker at putting the words on the page, my process in terms of plotting was pretty unchanged from my first starting point. I wrote patchworky, giving myself the headache of having to figure out what order I'd meant everything to go in once I got to the end of draft 1. So, as I have got stuff done and become less new at all of this, I have felt more and more pressure to get more professional at it. That's internal pressure, I have to say. And this has meant in my head that I should be better at planning. I definitely think I ought to be more like this. But in my heart, I am definitely more like this.
I would say I was a kind of fly by the seat of my pants.
There's an obvious immediate benefit to being a planner, one that is pertinent to independently published authors, but not untrue for traditional ones either, I'm sure. If you're able to increase the turnover of new books to the market, you will have a much greater chance of making sufficient money to live on. This is simple maths. More product equals more opportunities for readers to purchase more of your stuff. And if you garner some real fans along the way, the likelihood is that these readers will work their way naturally through your whole catalogue. It's called the magic read-through statistic. And it's why series of books are so popular with indie authors who rarely have big above-the-line marketing budgets for the one-off pieces. Plotting is the project management of a story, after all, and I used to hold the title of project manager, so you'd think I would be good at this stuff. But it seems not. In reality, when it comes to writing, I am much more like this. This is a quote from the lovely Stephen King, and I do really feel that this method is my process. Stories are found things like fossils in the ground. If you haven't read Stephen King's book on writing, then I think you're missing out. It's a great one, even if you never plan to write a thing, in my humble opinion. But in particular, the way he describes the necessity of planning the plot versus discovering the plot really did hit home to me. He talks about stories being relics, part of an undiscovered pre-existing world, and how the writer's job is to just use the tools in the toolbox to get as much of each story fossil out of the ground intact as possible. Stephen King talks about how he leans heavily upon his intuition and admits that this is due to his stories being mainly situation rather than story or plot. He watches what happens with his characters and writes it down. Simple, yeah? But this approach does feel like home to me. I'm nowhere near as accomplished or as good as Mr. King, of course, but I do recognise the uncovering aspect of it. However, I've got to say, it does feel a little bit more like this most of the time. Running around in the dark, tripping over my storylines, whispering into the emptiness, I'm not sure what I'm doing. And that is why I'm interested in seeing how I can get better at the planning plotline malarkey. So, I began to research how I might gain some skills of being a planner versus the arguably more, well, certainly in my head, I must be an amateur, I must be immature approach of flying by the plane by the seat of my pants only. And this is where I began. With Libby Hawker's Take Off Your Pants book. Now, I admit I was attracted by that headline up there. I mean, she wrote a 90,000 word novel in just 3 weeks. I mean, how? This needed investigation. This book is a guide to help you increase your speed and efficiency as an author, as the author herself says. It will provide you with a method for planning out a book's particulars before you begin to write, and therefore a method for ensuring your story is actually cohesive, compelling and satisfying. Well, that sounds just bloody marvellous, doesn't it? Here are a few more quotes from the book in favour of being a planner. Speed and volume will be critical to achieving your professional goals. The superior method for writing a book, if your goals include a full-time writing career, well, that seems fairly black and white, doesn't it? And then she makes the points that we have made before. As technology advances and eager indies bring more books to market with greater speed, even the long-established, traditionally published authors struggle to keep up. So this is an ideology which basically says that if you think things are fast now, then they're going to get faster, so you better learn how to be fast too, which I have to say gives me quite a bit of anxiety about the whole affair, but I'm willing to see if and what I can do to get on board. Should just sort of point out the dynamics of the book market and who and what is winning it is outside of this presentation scope, and not to mention my expertise. But based on Statista.com's data, book sales are approximately 40% lower than the high point, although 2020 did see a resurgence. Not surprising given how much enforced leisure time we as a population has suffered. Anyway, this makes the point, I guess, that the importance of the bookstore and having a physical book on a shelf somewhere is less important than it once used to be. That's also reinforced by the second graph from the same website, which looks at the digital revenue, digital markets, and you can see that ebooks, and in particular actually audiobooks, are definitely a growth market, and obviously ebooks and digital is one of the key areas that indie authors can compete effectively on. So yeah, it means that delivering new products to the market on a frequent and regular basis is definitely going to help you win your share of all this digital. So the magic formula, as Libby purports it to be, seems to be, if you want a full-time writing career, and I mean, how many writers set out on this long journey without that being their hope and dream in their hearts, that they could do it full-time without distraction and still have the ability to pay the mortgage? So this is, a compelling formula. If you want frequent 10-outer books, then she says you're going to need structured pre-planning. So statements such as this, where she points out that she does actually pansterize some books that she writes, but she doesn't consider those to be her commercial books. She considers them to be sort of literary and rites of folly almost. She doesn't actually call them that such a pejorative word, but anyway, for her commercial, the ones she depends to pay the bills with, she has to outline or nothing. She's very firm on that. Now, don't know if this is the right time to mention the F word, but let's get to it now. Formulaic, of course, folks, don't worry. I'm only referring to the concern that won't planning it all out end up meaning this is all a bit formulaic in style and structure. Well, it is a common fear, but I've got to be honest, it's not why I do not intricately plan out my novels. That, as we've discussed, is more of an issue of my not being able to see the story beyond a certain point in front of me. But to be honest, I don't see how planning can make one's novels formulaic in and of itself. If you follow the same plan for each of your novels, changing barely anything except for people's names perhaps, then yes, it's going to be formulaic. But there are so many story possibilities and variations on many themes that I think this fear is a bit of a red herring. I mean, there are only so many notes on the piano keyboard, but new songs keep getting written. Okay, so planning is, in a nutshell, a way of being efficiently productive, a way of boosting one's confidence that you're onto a good thing before you start writing it and waste a lot of time potentially, and a way of keeping you focused and on track without those procrastination moments that we all have. But it does have to beg the question of, if she spent only 3 weeks writing a 90,000 word story, how long did she spend planning them before she started to write it? She takes just 4 hours using her outlining method to construct a sizable plot, and then just 3 weeks to write the first draft. To be honest, it sounds like magic to me. But she makes a highly compelling case for the need of planning within the book. The planning process itself, as she points out, hardly takes any time, and then, of according to her, you're on a fast track. I won't go into her actual method because, frankly, I am the worst person to tell you about it. I confess, I got about halfway through the outline structures and I came to a grinding halt. I am indeed like a soothsayer who can only see so far into the future. No matter how hard I beat myself up or try to be a planner, my brain just keeps giving me the same answer to the question of what next, which is, I don't know, we'll have to find out when we get there. I did give up on Libby's structure and I wrote my second novel by the seat of my pants, or as a more kind way of describing my process, by just digging in the dirt and seeing what kind of fossil I was uncovering bit by small bit. Hands up though, I accept that by not sticking with the planning discipline, I create problems that inevitably need to be sorted out further down the timeline. This is the kind of sorting out I have to spend doing when I follow my true Panster heart. That's a list of writing pieces, chapters and scenes that I did in chronological order, how I wrote them, which now have to be figured out in terms of the timeline of the story, with gaps being identified and edits necessary to ensure the neat stitching between the joins, so to speak. So this is the most obvious price I pay for not planning out novels. It was painful in the kind of way that untangling Christmas lights is painful. Moments like this reinforce the absolute practical benefit of being a planner. So my quest to acquire the skills continued. Cue the next book on planning. This one is a wonderful heavy tome and covers more than just how to plot, doing the planning versus Panster bit. There's a list of what it's got in it, and it's written by a chap called Harry Bingham, who I really do like his style. He's realistic too. The machinery of plot is so huge, so cumbrous, that it's hard for a how-to book to dissect it without melting into vagueness and generality. So he does at least understand the problem that faces us all. And that quote pretty does much sum up my feelings about planning out plots. It just feels so huge and invisibly massive to me, and describes a lot of the reason why I failed to get my head around the various methodologies of planning. But anyway, so this book takes you through the art of story in 5 sections, and it'll give you classic plot lines, mystery plot lines, literary plot lines, for example. It stretches your thinking towards the screenplay angle. The perspectives from film is one of the chapters, which is quite interesting given how much story is beamed into our lives through film and TV. And there is also a chapter called Diagnosing Your Plot Problems, which includes the brilliant headers such as the 1/3 pause, the skeleton, clutter, bareness, and finally, who cares, which I think is really the point. It is a great read, and as I say, Harry's got a great warmth and unpretentious call a spade manner, so I enjoyed this book. However, pretty much the only key planning device I took out of it was this list of headers, which I use in my word count and chapter log spreadsheets. The key thing is that one in the centre there. How does this chapter or scene alter the protagonist's relationship to their goal? So if a chapter or scene isn't doing this act of movement, if there isn't an obvious sense of progression, then it's probably not needed for the purposes of a tight, well-told story. So this is one of the key liberations that becoming more organised is giving me. But the astute of you will perhaps have already guessed, I often fill in this column during or after I've finished writing the scene. I do not generally have much idea in advance of beginning the chapter what will occur, other than the top headline of the character's movement against their goal. But planning in retrospective still has its value. It's still a check on story progress and a map of the land that has been travelled, or should I say excavated so far. Mr. Bingham has got some excellent planning tools that, if nothing else, will get you started or stop you getting stuck. I should mention those. I cannot attest to having finished any of the exercises he sets. For instance, the 1001 questions he would like you to be able to answer about your character's character and backstory was kind of impossible for me to do. I realise again that beyond a certain point I really am finding out about my characters as I'm writing about them. But nevertheless, the exercises and planning sheets should be in every writer's toolbox, I reckon, even if you're like me, you only use a little bit at a time. If you like the free resources, perhaps consider buying the book as a thank you to him. Finally, I just want to draw your attention on this slide to the column header called STC Beat. So, what does STC stand for? It stands for Save the Cat. The Holy Trinity of Story. Now, with this book, I started to feel that I might just be able to dip my toe into planning and stick with it. I'm not sure I entirely agree with its tagline of the last book on novel writing you'll ever need, but I have found the structure and approach to be really rather helpful. This planning methodology was first born into the world of screenplays by a chap called Blake Snyder. It sets out the 15 beats or plot points that every great Hollywood movie ever made always contains. And one of the key aspects, hence the name Save the Cat, was that with every protagonist, you had to at some point give them a moment where they saved the cat and proved that they were worthwhile knowing, even if they were in actual fact a horrible character. And that's where it all comes from. So in 2006, this book's author, Jessica Brody, was, in her own words, a struggling studio exec turned struggling novelist with a serious case of self-confessed no idea about plot structure. I know how she feels. Jessica was handed a copy of the screenplay version of the Save the Cat book with the suggestion that she try it out for her novels. She did, and a decade later she has sold more than 15 novels to all of the big name publishers. You name them, Simon Schuster, Random House, so on and so forth. All of them based on the 15 plot beats she learned about with the Save the Cat methodology. This book has been written with the novel fully in mind. Writing screenplays for film is a different discipline than writing novels for obvious reasons. The thing I like about this book is that it can be applied at any point during your creative process. If you've totally pantsed your way through a first draft, you can use it to edit and craft the second draft. If you're halfway through pantsing your first draft and want to check what the story must have, if it is to feel like an interesting and satisfying story for its second half, you can use this book. Here are the 15 beats of the Save the Cat even planning method. I like it. The proof really is in the eat of the pudding. I've utilised it to do the most plotting I've ever done, looking further into the future of my stories than I have ever managed to achieve so far. This is whilst writing my fourth book. That doesn't mean, by the way, that what I have planned has actually turned up on the page. The story fossil is still throwing up some unusual moments of surprise for me, but it has meant that the expected rise and fall of what we all recognise as a compelling story is roughly happening at the points when it is most needed or most satisfying to occur. I have been able to get to key watershed moments of the story, like perhaps that midpoint, for instance, take a breath and use some time to plot out where my next leg of the journey is likely to head. At the moment, this structure feels like it's right for me. There's enough flexibility to it, and the beats are sufficiently autonomous for me to think of them as small bites of the elephant and not get overwhelmed and give up. It's keeping me focused on key elements of a satisfying story progression, and on a day-to-day basis, I'm feeling more accomplished and organised, but also being surprised and enjoying the unexpected discoveries that my characters want me to uncover. With this method, I'm beginning to relax into my writer's reality of being a panster, but feel safer about it because I'm doing a bit of planning and checking that the journey is an interesting, fast-paced and compelling one. I think I might have to coin a new phrase for my process. A pantling, perhaps, or pan-plotter. I'll give it some more thought. And you know, I shouldn't really feel too bad about being a panster. There are some big name authors out there who swear by it as a successful process. Mr. Lee Childs makes this statement about he's pretty famous for pantsing his books. As he says, I just start at the beginning, make it up, and somehow get to the end. This is another quote that he's got all about character. So if the plot works well, that's a bonus, but it's the characters that people remember. And he quotes the Lone Ranger. And it's true, I know about the Lone Ranger, but I couldn't tell you a single storyline from a Lone Ranger show. So yeah, it is about excellent characters. He makes a fair point, although that first quote does rather make me think of Basil Fawlty scolding Sybil about her ability to win the stating the bleeding obvious competition. Because we all, at some point, at some level rather, are starting at the start and ending up at the end. By the way, he also suggests that writers shouldn't listen to the advice of other writers or industry experts. Just saying. And he says the best thing any author can do is read lots and lots of books, which, well, that's no thing. On to the next one. John doesn't make plots in advance at all. He tries to throw people into a messy life and sees how they'll sort it out whilst he's writing. So the whole adventure is one I share with the reader. Again, sounds very romantic, doesn't it? I think this is kind of what Stephen King was referring to when he was describing his writing too. He talks about having that situational style of writing, which does have a looser feel to it than, for instance, if you're writing an intricate murder mystery of the likes of Agatha Christie. Of whom, just so that we have a little bit of balance, I went searching for some evidence or quotes from the more famous planners of the writing world, and this is one of Agatha Christie's notebooks. Apparently she made endless notes in dozens of notebooks, jotting down her ideas and potential plots and characters as they came to her. She's quoted as saying, "I usually have about half a dozen notebooks on hand, and I used to make notes in them of ideas that struck me, or about some poison or drug or a clever little bit of swindling that I had read about in the paper." But she, even with all the planning, was also quoted thus, "Nothing turns out quite in the way that you thought it would when you are sketching out notes for the first chapter or walking about muttering to yourself and seeing your story unroll." And probably the most widely known plotter of recent years is the Potter author J.K. Rowling. She infamously revealed her handwritten tables of plotting. They're impressive, aren't they, for the lack of crossing out, frankly. But maybe this is her 100th time of writing that particular table out. Who knows? Okay. Well, hopefully you've found this to be useful so far. If you have, phew. Either way, though, here's some more useful stuff. I'm pretty confident that you will all have heard about Joanna Penn. She has multiple non-fiction how to write books for writers. This is the one I recommend. It's good to return to regularly so that you can keep yourself keeping on at this thing called writing. And it deals with all of these moments of self-doubt, fear of failure, validation yearnings. Oh my goodness, we all have those. Perfectionism, the problem of, writer's block, comparisonitis that I've already mentioned, and overwhelm, and on and on. It's a good book, and as I say, if you haven't got a copy, then go grab one. Then there's Dan. Dan Blank is on my must work with list, and I have a personal goal that one of my novels will eventually appear on the bookshelves behind him when he is presenting his stuff to camera. When I'm feeling overwhelmed at the difficulty of being seen and heard, when I suffer comparisonitis with the more successful guys and gals out there, it is to Dan Blank's teachings that I turn for some seriously good advice. For instance, one of his pearls of wisdom is that behind every success story in the world, there are probably as little as 10 people who've had a direct influence on that success happening. So not the 10 million plus followers that you might be trying to collect on Twitter, just 10 real people, which all seems far more human scaled and frankly achievable. Still tricky, of course, because you've got to figure out which 10 people they are, but just 10, or maybe for you it'll just be one. I highly recommend this book for all creative types to get their head around the being seen side of the creating, the business side of it. I'm looking forward to reading his next book, which I know he's working on this year, and hopefully it will be out this year too. I've mentioned this quite a lot already. This is a famous book, of course, and this, I think, is its most famous quote on the craft of writing. I suspect there are not many of you who haven't treated yourself to Mr. King's wisdom. If you hate horror stories, this guy still has something valuable to offer you. I loved his books when I was pre-teen, so I was very happy to read about the behind-the-scenes life of their creation. Going back to that particular quote reminds me of a training course I was sent on during my corporate career days. It was a media training course of sorts, and the journalist teaching it told us something that has ended up being the only thing I can remember from that course to this day. It is on the theme of what Stephen King advises, but ironically, it is a bit more macabre than the great horror writer himself. On this course, we were told the importance of editing, and that we should think of our paragraphs as a sackful of puppies, and our job was to decide upon which puppy we were to save and which we were going to be drowning. As I say, horrible imagery, but effective in its purpose to A, be remembered, and B, get its point across. Editing is key. If you've planned your novel, then the amount of editing is probably going to be less than if you've pantsed your way along. Either way, the process itself is vital and requires a strong heart. By the way, the other key thing I took out of this book by Stephen King is the general rule that all pieces should be reduced by at least 10% in their editing, otherwise it definitely hasn't been edited correctly. It's just something to think about. Finally, 2 more books that I'd highly recommend adding to the toolbox if you haven't already had the sense to do so. The one on the left is another of Harry Bingham's book. It's a compilation of his weekly emails on all sorts of writing and publishing related topics. I like it because it makes me think. On the right is a series of thesauruses. This one is the emotion thesaurus. Frankly, it is easy to get yourself stuck in the same old descriptions for emotions or place or character flaws as the other thesauruses deal with. Getting stuck in that rut is kind of inevitable, and this is a way of brainstorming, doing a singular brainstorm by yourself, of getting away from your particular cliche. I keep them to hand so that I don't get too downhearted in the moment of capturing an idea and then stalling myself with yet another description of my character nodding their head, for instance. So I just pick up the book and look up what other mannerisms they could be doing, and more often than not, it stops me doing that awful perfectionism thing in the moment. So we draw this exploration into the mind of me to an end. I will leave you with this key point of learning that I have arrived at. You must do you. Oh, I know, it's in the realms of Lee Child's obviousness, isn't it? Possibly considered trite by some, but it is nevertheless true. Being the mother of a teenage daughter as I am, I often have to point this out to her, asking her if she isn't going to live her life the way she wants to live it, then whose life is she going to take over and live? I often embellish these lectures by pointing to random people in the street and say, his life? Or what about that girl over there? Will he live her life? It does earn me a few good eye rolls and teenage grunts, which I consider to be a sign of my excellent parenting. But in truth, these words are as much a reminder to myself to follow the creed. It doesn't matter how you write, planning everything up front, planning nothing and going for a scream of a ride, or something in between, or even outside of these. What matters is that you get it done in the best way possible for you. There are as many ways of writing a novel as there are writers writing them. Thank you for sticking with me on this jaunt around me. I do hope you've got something useful out of it. I would love to hear your thoughts and answer any questions you have. You can simply get hold of me at these points here, my website, and also DM me on Instagram. Also, just one last thing, it would be lovely, so lovely to have your name on my list of subscribers so that I can keep in touch with you on a more regular basis. Just head over to my website up there, racheldavidsonauthor.com, and click on the subscribe button. Again, thanks for being here. Until next time.